Continue. All right. And all right, everyone, welcome. I think everyone is, my screen is bouncing back and forth with a lot of people jumping into this. So hopefully we've invited everyone in. I'll turn it back on gallery view. So we do have a large group here, large enough that I don't have all of you visible on one screen at a time. So I'd like to welcome everyone to this mutual book interview between Dr. Brian Brock and Dr. Keith Dow. This is a hopefully fun and interesting conversation between two similar works that came out near enough to the pandemic that sadly they didn't quite get the press maybe that they deserved. Great books that would normally have been featured at conferences and at book talks. But of course, during the pandemic, these things weren't possible. And so today, hopefully we'll hear a bit more about some of the back end of why these books were written, some of the technical details of why did Brian choose this avenue and why did Keith pursue that. And we'll just have the hopefully wonderful experience of having two really insightful authors talking about their own process and the theologies that drove them. This is being kind of co-hosted by a number of groups. First, we have the Institute on Theology and Disability. I know I see several faces in here that I have seen at past institutes, so great to see some of you. There's some new faces as well. Very excited to meet, hopefully, some of you. At the end, I think, will have an announcement from the Institute concerning what our plans are for 2022. We'll hold off on that until the end. So some hopefully enticing you to stay for the whole event. In addition to the Institute, we are also very privileged and grateful to Baylor University Press, who not only published both Brian and Keith's books, but are also generously allowing us to use their professional Zoom for this event. So as a way of saying thank you, I'm going to turn the spotlight onto David Aycock, who is sort of in charge of all of this, and he has some special discounts for everyone here as a way of saying thank you all for joining us. So I'll turn it over to David.
Thanks, Topher, and to all of you who are here, we are nearly up to 40. Thank you for joining. It's 10 a.m. Texas time right now, and we are just so thrilled and proud to be a part of Brian and Keith's stories. Their books are meaningful, and I have the privilege of serving both as the interim director of Baylor University Press and also as the marketing, sales, and publicity guru. And both of their books have captured significant interest both in the academy and outside the academy. And so the series under which we publish lots of books on theology and disability. The SRTD series is what we call it for short, is a really important part of our publishing program. One of the things I want to offer to everyone on the outset is we're going to post in the chat a discount code that will allow you to purchase the books at a 30% discount plus free shipping anywhere in the United States. The free shipping does not apply to Canada, but I do think that, and I also will provide ordering instructions if you're in the UK or Europe. I'll provide a separate link to order over there. So everyone should be able to access that generous discount for purchases of these two great books. And so keep an eye on the chat, and if anyone has questions afterwards, I'll also leave behind my email address so that you can reach out to me with ordering issues. Back to you, Topher.
Thank you, David. Before we jump into anything further, I would like to draw your attention to the closed caption option at the bottom of your screen. If you look down to the very bottom bar, you'll see a black bar that has several options on it, including, I believe, the closed caption button. It's a little just gray square that says CC, and below it, it's titled closed caption. If you prefer having live captioning, it's not 100% accurate, but it has been increasingly made better over the pandemic. Zoom has put in a lot more effort to make sure that their closed captioning is as good as it can be. So that is one form of accessibility that you might find helpful today. This is also being recorded, and so we will post the video of this through our ITD channels at some point in the future, and we will do our best to modify the captioning if it needs to be, just to ensure that it is in fact accurate. So with all that being said, I'll also point out we have a chat function. For accessibility purposes, it would be helpful to write out your questions first before asking, and then we can sort of call on you and you can read your question out loud. This is meant to be a conversational piece, primarily between Keith and Brian. But if you have a really pressing and interesting question that furthers their conversation, by all means, we want to hear it. So please type your questions into the chat, and then we may call on you to maybe expand that question or for follow-ups. And at the time, or at the end, there will be time dedicated for more group discussion and for dedicated questionings. And we can always go back into the chat to see what questions hadn't been addressed to kick that section off. But for right now, I'm going to invite Professor Dr. Brian Brock, and then in turn, Dr. Keith Dow, to share a bit more about themselves and a bit more about why they've written the books that they have written, just to share a bit more about their personal situation, their context, as well as their research approach, and maybe a bit of an outline into the work that they've done to help anyone who hasn't read one or both of these books to understand where we're coming from and the type of questions that we are attempting to answer through these works. So, Brian, would you like to give us your introduction?
I'd be happy to. Thank you, Topher, and thank you, David, for hosting this opportunity for Keith and I to talk. As a prefatory remark, I'll say whoever decided to do this, I'm tempted to call an evil genius, because I kept coming across terms and ideas and descriptions and theological frameworks that also appear in my book, but about at a 30-degree sort of slant. So funnily enough, I just took my book out to look at it because I spent the last 2 days really poring over Keith's really marvelous book and trying to figure out why we're using the same terms but meaning something slightly different, and why that matters. And I hope we'll kind of figure some of that out as we go. My book came out of really fatherhood. I started out studying medical ethics, so I came across disability as a topic in medical ethics, and I always found it was interesting, but it's also the kind of topic that you don't really talk about unless you have some skin in the game. So I felt like it was something I wanted to pursue, but I want to pursue a lot of things. And I don't know, about 10 years later, our first child was born. His name's Adam. He's turned 18 in August, and he has Down syndrome and autism. And I tell a lot of that story in the book, but one of the reasons why it took me 10 years to figure out how to even start to do that is that it's obviously important that the disability discussion has described where it's gotten to with the phrase, nothing about us without us. And I'm a pretty classically able-bodied type person. So it was really difficult for me to think about how I would present that story, why I would present that story, to what ends I would present that story. And so part of what's going on in the book is my attempting to make space for people who would be described as able-bodied to get to be part of the discussion about disability. And one of the reasons I'm really delighted to talk with Keith today is that we're in the same situation, but from a slightly different angle. For me, the short answer to that question is, it's not obvious to me that Adam, who's, I don't like the term, and I explain why I don't like the term, but he would be classed as low, sort of low functioning, nonverbal. It's not clear to me that he would even have any way to understand what the term disability means or care what people mean by it. It's an irrelevant term to him. So I basically start out the book by saying, really what we're talking about is something that I'm experiencing. The label disability is ambiguously applied. It has a social function for generating support from, state governmental agencies for Adam, but in terms of his own self-definition, it has no meaning whatsoever. And I get very little, or I'm not labeled by the state as disabled, but a lot of the existential dilemmas that go around that term are mine and not his. And so that's how I begin to try to think through what we're talking about when we talk about disability. Because at the end of the day, my identity as a father will always be tied up with somebody labeled disabled. And it just troubles the easy location of disability with him, and my able-bodiedness being somehow detached from disability. With that starting point, I then just thought there's a lot of doctrinal apparatus in theology in the tradition that can help us to see what we're actually talking about when we talk about disability. And so I cover quite a bit of territory, but underneath it, I'm working through different doctrines. I'm talking about how do we think about affirming creation as good, but I do that by talking about prenatal screening. And we often talk about sin when we discuss disability. And I get at that topic by saying, what if the reason I have a problem with disability is that I'm a sinner, and it actually is less, sin is less relevant as a way of describing Adam and more relevant as a way of describing able-bodied people and their prejudices about disability. So I work through, healing and resurrection and ecclesiology. What does it mean to be the body of Christ? And I sort of have my own theological take on these things. I think I'll sort of end by saying that I think Keith and I are totally on the same page about caring that people with learning difficulties are well supported, looked after, loved, have friends in the societies in which we live. And I'm approaching that as a father, and Keith is approaching that as a sort of part of a care provider institution. And so I actually, funnily enough, tonight, after this, I will have to go to a board meeting for a care institution that gives Adam respite, which I've been involved with for a few years. So I kind of switch those hats back and forth sometimes. So I feel like part of the reason I was really engrossed in Keith's book is it is hard to answer the question, how would you choose and hire people to work in care institutions, and what would it matter if you're a Christian or not? So I'm really excited to talk about that. And frankly, I've been thinking more about his book than mine. So I hope I hope he'll press me to talk about issues in my book that might be useful to people, because I haven't been thinking much about it.
Yeah, and I guess I'll carry on here with a bit of an introduction for myself and the work, but just wanted to say thank you as well for the invitation to be part of this conversation. And I don't think either Brian or myself take ourselves too seriously, so hopefully we can have a bit of fun as well, and recognizing that these are serious topics, but at the end of the day, you know, we only understand things so far. And so hopefully your questions will help draw some of that out and add to our learning and our knowledge as well as it concerns some of these things. So I'm joining you. I'm here just south of Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. And I serve as Brian alluded to, I work with a large organization serving people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And my official title is Manager of Organizational and Spiritual Life, which is a bit of a mouthful, but it encompasses a number of different things. So I help provide grief support for people. I help to work with faith communities and churches to talk about how can we really include and welcome people with disabilities and what we've been missing out on with our stigma and the barriers that we've erected. And also, what does it mean to be a Christian faith-based organization? So some of the deeper theological thinking about really what this book talks about, and that is, you know, how can we serve well? What does ethics look like as part of care provision? What does mutuality look like as part of that as well? So it's not just a system of care, of professional care, if you will. And what is the really human element or dynamic of that? And more specifically, as a Christian or a faith-based organization, does that make a difference, right? Can we just adopt kind of the standards of care that we see in the world around us and be fine with that? And so I dig into that a bit in terms of, you know, competencies and professional ethics and what resources are there and what resources aren't there when it comes to engaging with one another as human beings and as spiritual beings as well. And so the life journey that brought me to write this, I was studying philosophy. I think it was back in 2004 that I first started my bachelor's in philosophy, later took a master's in philosophy. And as part of that journey, I came across the writing of Soren Kierkegaard, who really, you know, reflects on it's not just believing certain things about truths. It really matters how we relate to those truths in our own lives. And our relationship with the truth is one of the most fundamental things. So it was kind of this paradox of studying these great systems of thought and philosophical ethics, but still feeling like I didn't have a natural outlet for that, that I wasn't really engaged in my world in a way that demanded something of me, that asked something of me. And so I talk about in the book is that's kind of a calling to, it's calling to more. And I don't want to pretend that that's a calling to meet the needs of others so much as a calling to meet the need of myself to live out my Christian faith, to practice, you know, some of the things that I've been thinking about and considering about what it means to live a good life, what it means to serve others well, what it means to be a faithful person. And so that kind of combined with being in philosophy and not having a stable income led me to work with Christian Horizons here in Ontario, Canada. And so I served a number of years in a direct support professional role. And so on the one side, I was kind of engaged in this practical care. On the other side, I was taking my master's in philosophy at that time and studying Kierkegaard. And so it was really a joy when those two things came together. I stepped into my current role. I had the opportunity to meet Hans Reinders and Tom Reynolds through the Institute on Theology and Disability. And then there was a cohort of people who were interested in doing a PhD in theology and disability. And so that's where some of these thoughts really were able to be developed, and ask the question, what does it look like for direct support professionals, for people in care work, professional care work, what does the motivation and formation of people look like in those capacities from a Christian standpoint? And of course, as I dived into that, I realized that the questions are so much bigger than that, that they get to the heart of what it means to be human, what it means to engage the humanness of ourselves with the humanness of other people as created in the image of God, and that these questions explode just the professional standpoint and ask what it means to relate to one another as we're telling the story of who we are, as we're interpreting the stories of others, as we're seeking to understand God. What are the limits of that understanding, and how do those limits really change the way that we relate to one another and to God, and love neighbors? And so my hope and my prayer is that while this book started with very specific questions, that the implications really should transform the way that we interact with anyone around us, because in some capacity, all of our relationships are relationships of care in one way or another. And so the flow of the book starts tackling that question, starts asking about calling and vocation. So what are some of the ethical resources we can draw from calling and vocation? What is a distinctively Christian understanding of the Imago Dei that helps us to relate to one another in meaningful ways? And what are the limits on that as well? What are times that we overstep and our theology kind of takes the place of meaningful human relationships and interaction, encountering one another? And then what are some of the myths of transparency? Again, where does our intellect sometimes overstep and make assumptions about others and who they are, make assumptions about ourselves and our ability to know ourselves, and then our assumptions about God as well. And then finally, it wraps up with, okay, so taking some of these limits, both embodied limits and intellectual and epistemological limits seriously, what are the virtues that we need when we're relating with one another? What are the virtues that we need when we're in these relationships of care? So that's a quick summary, and I'm excited to be able to dive into it. As Brian was saying, I've in the last couple of months, I've been poring over his books and his book, and it was a couple of days ago that I was kind of like, okay, well, I've got all these great quotes from Brian's book, and I want to talk about all these things, and oh yeah, I should probably have a little refresher in mind because it's been a while, and so going back to that, and so I'm looking forward to the conversation here.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both. What I'd like to kick us off with is I'm going to pose a question for both of you to respond to that I found really interesting about both your books. I mean, I found a lot of things interesting about both books, and there are so many questions that I'm sure all of us could come up with. But this question is hopefully a bit broader and gives us maybe a bit more insight into maybe the inner workings of the author mind. And then maybe once we've kind of had a little discussion, then if you both have questions for each other, I'd love to invite you to maybe start kind of teasing through and sharing those and just having more of a discussion that way. But I'll kick us off with this first question, which comes as a recognition of the unique ways you each have of blending theological source material to make it useful and available to further theological inquiry. So Keith, you mentioned, you have this reliance on Kierkegaard and some very traditional theologians and some ways of thinking really theologically in pretty standard ways. But then you also use the voices and experiences of people that you have direct engagement with through caregiving experiences or just general life experience. Typically people who identify with disabilities, intellectual disabilities primarily, and you allow their voices and experiences to act as theological source material in your book. And Brian, obviously, you make a big point about this in your book as well, using sort of not just the narrative of having Adam as a son, but using snapshots of events happening in Adam's life and in your life that hold theological meaning. And then, I mean, as well, you also you cite fairly standard, Augustine and Luther, but then also some Jewish authors and some medical ethicists who are not theological sources, not Christian theological sources, perhaps in a standard sense. So my question here is, I would love to know what sort of boundaries you place around discerning what is a theological source text, or what serves as appropriate theological source material that helps you further these ideas and dig out something that is truly theological in nature, and how you came to that for these particular projects. So whoever wants to take a stab at that one first.
Sure, I'm happy to jump in there, and it's a bit of a mess, to be honest. And honestly, I think that's okay. That Friedrich Nietzsche, and I quote him early on, talks about how any great philosophy, and I'm not claiming this is great philosophy, but any worthwhile philosophy, and I would say theology, is a kind of unself-conscious memoir. And so I think perhaps part of what Brian and I are doing in these books is to become a bit more conscious about the ways that our interactions with others actually do shape and frame our theological thinking and our theological story. And so you talked about boundaries and kind of what classifies as a good source material in that sense. And for me, I didn't have many boundaries. That taking that relation to the truth seriously meant that there were all sorts of sources that came up to draw from, people who engage with these themes and theories, who might be theologians or philosophers. I looked to Judith Butler a lot, and I was thinking this over the last couple of days. Her book, actually, I'll hold it up here because I do recommend it as well, Giving an Account of Oneself. When I came across this book, it was just like she had put into words so much of what I was thinking in a way that was better than I could put it. She told that story well. She gave an account well. And so for me, it was really just a matter of clashing these counts up against one another. And when I talk about the stories of people who use their services and the ways that they've impacted me, or when I talk about my own journey to caregiving as a calling, I'm careful to say an account of such and such, giving an account of such and such. And my hope is there, I don't know if people catch up on, caught this or not, my hope there is to put some brackets around that, to say this is one very limited account, this is one interpretation, this is a fragment of the story, this isn't the whole picture. I'm not claiming an authoritative account. And in the same way, when I'm drawing from sources, I don't want to say that they're the authoritative account, that there are pieces there that kind of interact with my own story and these other authors in I think really meaningful and important ways. And that's really kind of gets at the heart of the book as well. If we are formed together, if our stories are shaped by other people's stories in sometimes mind-boggling ways, right? How does our theological reflection reflect that? And as I started with, it's a bit of a mess, and hopefully a beautiful mess. I find it a beautiful mess of thoughts and ideas and authors, but I think that's okay too. And if people want to come back and challenge certain aspects of that, then I welcome that conversation too.
One of the places where I had to really think about how what I'm doing and what Keith are doing are related is when he, in a chapter that I really like, 100 pages into the book, says, we don't really know ourselves fully because we're radically relationally constituted. That's a quote. And almost on the first page of my book, I make that claim. So there's a sort of Keith is doing some work to get to that claim. And I'm basically saying, how can I know who I am without the ways other people look on me? And primarily the divine person, how God looks on me. So my answer to your question, Topher, is that I am relationally constituted. So tradition names a group of people over time who I need to join to see the world that they see and to see things in the world that they would see as they would see them. And scripture is one of the ways that they encoded what they saw in their life with God. And so I have a kind of relatively well-developed account of how scripture holds together a kind of life world, a lived existence that we can enter, and that the sort of community of faith is has an epistemological implications. And that the end result of that is that I think to enter into that community frees you to engage with anyone, because we also are in relationships with all sorts of people all the time and all sorts of traditions of thinking. So my own feeling is that I'm exploring the inner contours of the long tradition that we call Christianity, that grows out of the faith of Israel, and that faith, it's by its own logic, actually goes into all kinds of realities that other people who don't participate in that tradition do know something about. So there's that kind of picture of tradition that's allowing me quite a bit of freedom to deal with not classically theological sources, but also I have a kind of account of the divine revelatory appearing and its connection with human beings and what they do, that allows me to read other human beings and the things that they do, even non-verbal human beings, as somehow Christ's presence and claim on us. So I'm really, there's a kind of author, since you ask about author's dilemmas, there's an author dilemma behind it. I've, over the pandemic, since I wasn't touring around talking about Wondrously Wounded, I wrote a kind of popular book for Baker called Disability. So I started out trying to speak to the disability community as a non-disabled person, right? So that creates certain technical dilemmas. How do I even speak about it if I'm part of that demographic who has typically overruled the voices of people with disabilities? And if you sort of work through some of the pieces of that puzzle, as I've suggested, part of it is to trouble who's in and who's out of the disability community. On the backside of that is the question, how do I speak truthfully about myself and, in this case, Adam? And I've tried to do that as robustly as I can in Wondrously Wounded, and that means speaking about him as a member of the transtemporal community of faith, which means not everything that happens in his life do I understand as the divine claim on me, but some things that happen, I do see that way. And often, and this is one of the places that Keith and I might explore, Keith's book is primarily focused on the relationship between the speaker and someone with learning difficulties. And my book, in part because of its reliance on God's own action through people, is often looking at what is God doing through Adam to other people, right? So it has a I'm kind of watching what happens with him that's revelatory. That's not directed at all to me, but I'm an onlooker, right? So I think that kind of revelatory theology empowers him in ways that he may not even grasp, but which I think he lives. So the sort of third layer of the authorial problem is getting right what I see and what I want to say is actually kind of complex, because I'm not seeing what most people see when they run across Adam. And I've done that work in Wondrously Wounded. But I've had some people give me the feedback that what I see and what I experience is not only so sort of theologically framed that it seems almost impossible to get a grip on, but my life experience with Adam is so different that also they can't get on the same page with that. So in this new book, I didn't tell the story of Adam at all. I don't even introduce him. I just relate other people's stories. And interestingly, I hadn't really expected it, but kind of almost immediately, some people with disabilities, physical disabilities, basically criticized me pretty directly for not talking about my own experience and talking about other people's experience. So I think, I think it's being a kind of white man in the world we live in and the time we live in. I'm happy to be the all-time bad guy, and it's time to be that. But it's a really ticklish territory that Keith and I are working in. And my sort of last lap around the track was to say, let me just tell other people's stories, right? There are good stories out there. Let me collect those stories for you and situate them so that you kind of get them in bulk. And some people who have disabilities experience that as me hiding my own personal investment in the story. And I think I would just say, as an author, anyone who writes on disability will eventually run across these problems themselves. And maybe it's just useful to talk about how they run.
Yeah, maybe just to chime in there. So I definitely relate to everything you're sharing. And I mean, one of the challenges of this work, in my book in particular, is that it's kind of an intellectual attack on intellectualism, right? There's an inherent paradox there, and I don't try to pretend that it's not there. But I think as part of privilege, and unfortunately, there's a lot of privilege attached to being able to tell stories. And so, Brian, you mentioned early on, like this dynamic of having the power to tell Adam's story, perhaps in a way that he's not able to tell it. I think there's a certain responsibility comes with that to also critique that. And so whether you're in the academy or whether you're in a professional kind of service place, to ask challenging questions of that regime of truth that kind of makes it such that certain people have powers to tell stories and certain people don't. And I don't want to pretend that bracketing the accounts that I give covers over the issue or makes it okay. But my hope is that in telling these stories, of giving an account from my own perspective, but recognizing that these are just slivers of the account, that it starts to raise those questions in important ways in theological and philosophical thinking, in ethics, in a way that I think you do as well, Brian. And part of this is, what is the role of mystery and revelation in our writing, in our thinking, in our relation to God, in our relation to one another? And I fear that because there are things that we can't put into words, they're concepts, or I can't even find the right word for it. They're encounters really that aren't captured in our theological discourse. And so I say in the book, where mystery is that which we cannot describe because we cannot comprehend it, revelation is that where we understand only because we have received it. So revelation is something that we we can't manufacture on our own. We have to receive that from outside, and we receive that from people around us as well as from God. And then mystery is just incomprehensible in the way that we can't tease it out. It goes above and beyond anything that we're able to fully capture in words. And so, Brian, you tell this impactful story about, and you can fill in the details here, but where Adam meets a gentleman on the street, and this gentleman on the street is quite angry, and he's kind of coming at people aggressively. And Adam just puts his hand on the man's mouth, which is a powerful and striking image that I would not dare to do that. I would kind of look the other way, like the leader in terms of passing the person on the side of the road in the story of the Good Samaritan. But Adam goes right to the man and encounters him in a powerful way. And one of the quotes from Judith Butler that I really appreciate, and this is one of those things that just sticks in my mind and comes back again and again, is that the very unrecognizability of the other brings about a crisis in the norms that govern recognition. And as with most of the things she says, I have to repeat that to myself to get a better handle on it. So she says, the very unrecognizability of the other brings about a crisis in the norms that govern recognition. And I think a part of what she's saying there is that because we cannot comprehend something, because we cannot put it into words or dissect it or write a book about it in a way that captures it, it invites those bigger questions. As Brian was saying, it troubles the waters in which we swim. And I think we see that happening in that story you were telling, Brian, about Adam. And there's almost an encounter with that situation before we even start to think about it, before recognition happens, as in, okay, this is what happened here. I can start to make sense of it. There's almost a mystery, and then your title is Wondrously Wounded, right? There's a wonder, there's a mystery in those encounters with people, particularly who are different than us, or people who don't fit within the normal ways of telling stories, that challenges us and provokes us. And so I don't know, Brian, if you want to fill in any gaps on that story, or if that's something that stood out to you as well in terms of revelation and mystery and the role they play in our thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. And let me be clear. And Masters ask in the chat, is it just about how Adam impacts other people? And I was highlighting that that's what's different between Keith and I. So Keith's account is really about how it's a dyadic relationship. There's two, and how does the other who I don't know impact me, and how does my otherness impact them, right? And I'm saying one of the most profound ways that Adam actually impacts me is how he impacts others, right? It's not about how he reacts to me, it's what he does to others. There's another story about him. I mean, obviously putting your hand on someone else's mouth, a stranger's mouth, is especially after COVID, as you can imagine, that's a rather explosive sort of behavior, and it can be explosive. And there's a lot of other stories I could tell about that. Thankfully, that particular behavior has mutated into less interpersonal types of hands-on relationship. But the stories I tell about that behavior are sometimes when people get angry about it, because I think that's revealing, but more potently in the way that Keith is talking about. Sometimes it's just sort of unbelievably unexpected in ways that I can't shake the sensation he's channeled something about reality that I didn't see. I tell another story about our pastor, preaching a sermon, which came onto Jesus is teaching on divorce, and it was a small congregation, and there was a divorced couple sitting right there. One was the organist, and he was extremely uncomfortable preaching that sermon. And as we were taking communion after the sermon, Adam put his hand on our pastor Isaac's mouth for the first time at the communion rail. Part of the reason I have avoided talking about Adam is that those sorts of experiences are almost certainly the most real experiences that I have. And it does seem to me they're worth talking about. And as I say at the outset of the book, I feel like my existence comes into its actual proper shape when I deploy my intellect and my training and my sort of study of the tradition to narrate that in terms that I think the great figures and the small figures of our tradition would recognize. And of course, that's not how people see it necessarily when it happens, but the most unbelievable, crazy things happen in Scripture, and the stories of the people in Scripture lead us to expect that to happen in our life as well. So I really do, from the outset, treat Adam as a baptized believer. I talk about how I understand his own faith and his own discipleship. But for me, and again, to return to Anne's question, the things that he receives and hands on, I can only understand as from the life-giving Spirit. And I think that's what we should be talking about.
I think an interesting follow-up to all of this is the question of where does this work go? If we're talking about questions of how ought we see reality and how ought we narrate these types of experiences in a way that is meaningful, not just to us as the author or as the reader, but ideally applicable to the wider church and to the rest of those who are engaging with this pan-temporal tradition, as Brian puts it. It's a question of, well, what's next, and how ought the wider church maybe respond? One way as you talk right now, Brian, I'm just reminded of the recovery of the angelic tradition that Rabbi Julia Watts-Belzer gave as a plenary at an earlier institute, I think in Raleigh, where she talks about this profound revelatory experience, that there's something so profoundly real about the presence of an angel, but it's impossible to discern what is real until it has been revealed to you, and that it is the uncovering of a reality that you didn't realize was there, as opposed to perhaps the way angelic figures have been leveled against the disability community often, in really negative and stereotypical ways. So I'm just sort of jumping all over you and acting as though I'm the author of your book. But that's just sort of one thought of how might we use this to further our own traditions. And I'm curious for both of you where you see these works landing for the broader church, and what maybe more immediate next steps we might be taking.
Yeah, there's really something to, I think, what Brian's saying about those moments that we are um, impacted by or touched by, I guess, our encounters with others in such a way that we become more aware of our encounter with God in the reality of the world. And I've only just started to think about how that happens in creation, so beyond the human to human interaction. But I think both of our books deal more with what does that human to human relation look like, whether that's seeing God at work in the interrelationality of others, or experiencing that in an encounter with ourselves. And towards the end of the book, I start realizing, and even just historically, the impact of my relationship with my mother. This won't be a psychology session, but has impacted my writing as well. And in the 16 years leading up to 2018, she had a brain tumor early on, and then eventually another one came along and ended her life. But through that process, it was a real wrestling with like, who are we as human beings? What role does our intellect play in it? Because the brain tumor really changed who she was in some really hard ways and in some beautiful ways. And the virtues that she embodied became different as well, in terms of her worship of God, for instance, was just something that would move everyone around her, just that relationship that she had with him and the way that she expressed that in moving and in singing and those types of things. But I remember a moment when she was actually just above me here. I'm in the downstairs office in the kitchen, and everyone else had left, and it was just my mother and I. And this was towards one of our last visits with her. And she was by the stove, and she was taking out pots and putting pans on the stove and taking out lids. And it wasn't in any order that I would have recognized. That she would kind of stack them up and take them off and put them in different places and move them around. And we spent maybe 10 to 15 minutes together, me just being there with her as she went through this. And she was kind of like mumbling, singing to herself as she did it. And I was caught between this tension of, how would this appear to anyone walking in on us, and how does it appear to me as, as her beloved son here. And in that moment, it was absurd, from telling a story kind of a standpoint, absurd what she was doing. But I also felt like she was at peace. She was in an area that, she had spent so much time in caring for us as she prepared meals, and this kind of liturgy, this ritual of moving things around. She felt like she was at home in a really profound way. And so if we think about, what does this mean for the church? I feel like I'm a long way off in some ways, but how does the church become, or for those joining from different faith traditions, how do our faith traditions become spaces where we are free to encounter the divine in the way that God wants to meet us through the lives of others? And so it's my hope that the virtues of care towards the end of the book, where I talk about humble courage, quiet attentiveness, confession and forgiveness, loving mercy and lament and mourning. These are ways of being with each other that hopefully really take stock of our limits and don't overreach and don't try to impose our own story on other people's lives and their experiences of the world, but to open us to the experience of how God wants to interact with us. And I know even in working with faith communities as well around accessibility and removing barriers, that there can be a lot of really great energy around that in saying, okay, how do we remove this barrier? How do we fix the space? How do we confront some of these attitudes? And those are all wonderful, wonderful things. But until we take the time to really be with people and understand their experience of the world, I mean, part of the temptation might be in that situation with my mom to come in and say, no, mom, this is how you do it, right? This is how you actually make something. And I think we see those kinds of attitudes at play in our churches in a number of different ways. So how do we have the practices, the postures, the dispositions, if you will, that make space for people to be who they are, as well as then confronting the barriers and challenges that people face?
I mean, my answer is very much what Keith has just tried to describe. And I think I've been a little more outspoken and ambitious in saying that I actually think when we're talking this way, we're presenting an alternative gospel to the dominant sort of way people understand what Christianity is. So it's a kind of internal counter offer to Christianity means getting your life in order, becoming healthy and right with God and having a meaningful existence, which is the type of Christianity that in the end boils down to coming in and saying Keith should be teaching his mom what happens in a kitchen when she's lost her memory, or hand over hand sort of showing her how to do it right. And the same sort of things happen in church when we think of going to church as a performance that needs to be put together in a certain way. And therefore, people with all kinds of disabilities just are fitting badly. And I'm seeing more regularly and clearly how the inability of a church to receive what appears to be problematic and angular in church is simply a symptom of a church, a gospel that can't handle human beings whose lives don't conform to a very specific template. Apologies for my bell. So I really do think that, apologies again, if we can depict in real living color, and this again is the function of stories, what it looks like to say that the gospel doesn't make us tell people who make funny noises in church to be quiet, but to actually experience them as genuinely giving something into the worshiping community. That's the tangible experience of what the gospel means and how Christ gives life into broken humanity. That allows us to also see that we don't have to fix everyone else. And I say that without, I mean, in a way, Keith's situation with his mom was a little more straightforward. She didn't need to be trained, right? But I live with Adam, and like there are certain things that he needs to learn how to do. So there's a kind of, I do have to shape him, and he is shaping me. And the tradition of describing our reality that we call the Christian tradition is shaping us all. And so it's a kind of constant hermeneutic activity that I think the theologian should be able to speak about in ways that reveals lives that society thinks aren't important, as at least as important, and often precisely because they're rejected theologically, even more important to attend to.
That's great. Let me just pause and just say thank you to both of you for being willing to share fairly intimate details of relationships, important relationships that you both have that are formative to you, as people and as authors. I think in theology, we often like to think that there is less standing in between us and the people we're reading, because we do affirm so much of the same worldview, and we are knit together in certain ways. And I think this just is an indication that in many ways that that desire to be close to the author is right and good. And when it's done well, it does help us not just feel, good emotions, but to uncover some real tangibly good, powerful theological insights. So just thank you both for being willing to share that. And I think in the chat, people are clearly grateful for your willingness to be open about these things. I'm going to end my questions with just one sort of free-flowing question for each of you, which is just, I'd love to know what you found to be the most intriguing aspect of the other person's book. Maybe it's a really great quote that you pulled, or a theological turn, or whatever it was, a creative retelling of Luther. What was most intriguing to you about the other person's book?
And what I kept going around and meditating on is our different sort of paradigm stories. And Keith tells, I read Keith's book when it was his thesis. The first time we met, I don't know, a decade ago. He can correct me on times. And I remember one of the two stories that he tells from that first reading 10 years ago, and it's still in here kind of in a honed form. And it's the story of him. It's a kind of worked and detailed example of him being subject to violence as a support professional. And it's a very insightful and theologically rich and humane story. And then the one that I didn't remember, that I don't even know if he told it in the first version of the thesis, is the story about Michael, who stuck with him and kind of catalyzed his thinking, because Michael was high enough functioning to think that he didn't need to be in the group home. And so he'd move in and out and in and out and in and out. And finally they said, "You're not coming back if you move out again." And Michael, kind of was out of touch and, moving around. And eventually Keith found out that he had died on the streets. And that was really, catalytic for him thinking through what it means to be a Christian in a context like that. And I think those sort of questions are absolutely the kind of questions that have to be in play if we're going to think about what we have to say to care institutions as Christians. But it was just really kind of, that's where my two hats started to really provoke me to think more, because I have a son who lives in those institutions sometimes, and I sit on the board of those institutions trying to hire people, and those hats fit very differently in certain respects. In fact, that we had a pretty chilling story of 3 people dying at an institution here in Britain last week, and we had a pretty gut-churning conversation in the charity about whether we had some gaps in our management that might allow that to happen. And this is the idea as a parent that you would send a kid for a weekend away and get a break, and they would not come home. So the issues at stake are extremely pointed. And in fact, there was one incident one time, and this particular respite institution, which is a charity, was mortified, but he'd sort of gotten up in the middle of the night. He's up in the night a lot, which is part of our family side. But there was a bath that hadn't been drained, And he thought, hey, there's the bath, I'm going to get in. So like they found him sitting in the bath at 10 years old. Baths, for instance, I'm just telling that story because baths are one of the real danger zones in care. So I have every respect for Keith living in that world, because it feels very fraught in all kinds of ways, because good care certainly demands more than you're paid for, and it's very hard to get carers in any case. So there's this juggling around to do the best you can with the people who turn up, and right. So I have real respect for what Keith does, and it to me seems well, pretty shocking that most churches just would have no idea that that's going on, let alone be involved in it. So I think that's one of the ways in which a voice like Keith's is incredibly important for a church to just understand where it lives in the world and how it should be connected to people who are negotiating these kind of problems. And if it does so, that sort of weaves it into our societies in all the right ways.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. That's really encouraging, and I think you've touched on a number of things related to this field and to other care settings as well. So you think of long-term care, especially through COVID and some of the challenges that they've faced, and it's really that dance between the accountability and structures and professional training that you need in these places, and then how do we recognize the limits of our own humanity, right? How do we give account for those things that we need to be accountable for, and let go of those things, or receive the forgiveness of God, receive the forgiveness of others for those aspects that we can't control, or those aspects that exceed us, or that we didn't know. And that's certainly one of the big challenges. Something that I mean, there are a number of things obviously that stood out to me from Brian's book. One of them is just the scope that he's able to touch on here. It's really quite impressive, the number of areas he's able to tackle, and through each chapter there are new quotes that kind of stand out to me that, wow, he's really put it so succinctly here. But if I was to talk about what's going to stick with me, one of the things that's going to stick with me, he writes, "A God who interrupts the certainties of the age is a God who inspires hope. The God who interrupts the certainties of the age is a God who inspires hope." And there are tons of really robust theological and theoretical and what have you critiques in this book of medical ethics and our limits of our epistemology and all those types of things. But at the same time, as a father and as a Christian, that we make it through this book with a sense of hope, especially reading the different stories of encounters with medical professionals in particular, but also with the church as well at times. Like I think that's what's needed in an age like we have, is that resilient hope, and it's not something that we can manufacture. It's something that evidently, Brian, maybe you can speak to this, but you've received, or you're a witness to, or we're a witness to, right? The fact that that hope is still possible, hope is there, and hope really shines when it seems like there's no hope, or when there are no answers. There's a musician, his name's Drew Miller, and he's just coming out with an album called "There Will Be Surprises." I love how succinctly he's put that I think I think I'm a bit too cynical sometimes, and I expect most surprises to be bad. like I want to have things planned, and that's why my book is as much writing to me as it is to anyone else, right? It's a reminder to myself of my own limits, and that God can break, always above and beyond and beside and supporting who I am, and so I receive that as well from Brian's book, and that's been such an encouragement to me, that someone who has tremendous intellectual capacity, academic rigor, all those things can both capture and sustain and inspire hope through a work such as this one. So maybe just to turn it back to you, Brian, like we're in dark times in many ways. We're in difficult times, and like the situations you talk about in care provision, for instance, have only been heightened and made worse by the pandemic. And I mean, even in church settings or in faith community settings, we see a lot of people who have left and might not return. And so this is a big question, but what is it that gives you hope for the days ahead, both in terms of accessibility and that, whether it's in medical settings or church, and just in the Christian faith in general, for God's working in the world today?
Any other small questions you want to throw on there? I mean, I think what I've learned from, a long time of drinking as deeply as I can manage from the great theological writers is that sin is predictable, and social sin is also predictable. So you kind of know what's going to happen when the economy goes down, like we're going to stop funding expensive, a cohort of people who cost a lot of money, like, the people that you look after and I live with, right? That's totally unsurprising, right? So that's in a world that is filled with and organized by the sinners whose instinct will always be self-preservation. There's a predictability, a stability to it that you can see coming, right? And there's the veneer of altruism slips pretty quickly when the financial pressure comes. And I'm sure you've seen that, Keith, and we've certainly seen it. I mean, just practically speaking, we've spent a whole lot of time with Adam over COVID. His last year of school, he was supposed to be transitioning into something else. He only went to school a couple of months the past pandemic, and he hasn't gone to anything else. So I spent all day with him today, because we finally, after a certain number of years, decided that my wife, Stephanie, who's a nurse, wasn't going to give up her career. And she's just started before pandemic working again. She, as a nurse, she works 12-hour shifts. So when the chips are down, the state is going to try to save money by not looking after the people who nobody's going to squeal about. And we feel that on a daily basis. So that's very close. And it does seem to me that it does give you a kind of twofold sense that people who don't play by the rules in a non, Stephanie actually works in the prison. So there are people who don't play by the rules, who break the patterns of the normal, but they usually break in the wrong direction. And that's why she gets to meet them. But people with disabilities don't do what people expect for other reasons. And I mean, it is very existentially real for me that in part because Adam doesn't have all that kind of worrying mind that I have. He is reacting to us at levels that we maybe would be better off all relating on, right? Like this guy that was angry on the street is clearly sort of coming out of his pain, and Adam could somehow see past the surface to his, I mean, we use the language of heart, but I think it's sort of the affective level of the human being. And I've seen what that does in church, and I've seen the way he behaves in church and the way he kind of comes into sync with what's going on and goes out of sync. And there's patterns to that. And I've seen that when he's there and he's participating on his wavelength, it changes how everyone there experiences what's happening. And so that the kind of disruption of the way sinners do things, sinners in church want to look good. They want to act like everything's okay. They want to perform. They want to, I see Lorraine Williams is here, who's a doctoral student of mine. She is the pastor of a deaf church. And, if you don't, it's kind of unsightly to have the signer right next to the pastor, especially if you're looking for slick, TV presentation. So there's an aesthetic to it, and it is genuinely part of my own faith. And I kind of end the book by saying, thankfully, Christ is the one who disrupts all of those denuding patterns. And here's some of how I've learned that in my own life from Adam, who's just, he's clearly a sinner, but he's also he's not trapped in some of the games that the rest of us play. And that makes him vulnerable in certain contexts, but it also makes him, you can't say like the people who break the rules and end up in prison that he's morally culpable for being who he is. And the kind of potency of that on a daily basis. I mean, Keith, you must have seen this traveling around with people. Like they're not being who everybody thinks you should be. But it's kind of visible that you can't hold it against them. And I think that's really quite promising. And if we could be a society that wasn't so unsettled by that and wanted to sort of clamp everybody into the efficient shape, we'd certainly be a better church. And as a better church, we would call the world to be a better world.
Keith, if I might interject before you get a chance to respond. I recognize that we're slowly encroaching up on what is for me 5:30, as well for Dr. Brock. For others, it might be noon or 1, and you might need to run out to get some lunch. But before we leave, I would like to invite you all, if these are the kinds of conversations that you find fascinating and intriguing and life-giving, there are 2 opportunities that I'd love to make known to you. The first is you are all very welcome to join an online postgraduate diploma in disability theology at the University of Aberdeen with Dr. Brian Brock, as well as Dr. Leon Van Omen, who I think is in attendance here today. You can find more out about that by reaching out either to Dr. Brock or Dr. Van Omen, or by searching the University of Aberdeen website for postgraduate diploma, Theology and Disability. That would be something that, sorry, my internet is a bit unstable, so I'll go dark here for a second. That would be something that would fit, hopefully all of you. It's, I believe, fully virtual and can be done from anywhere in the world, not just here from Scotland. And Leon has put a link in the chat as well as his email, and he would be the person to reach out to for that. The other opportunity is that the Institute on Theology and Disability did not meet in 2021 due to the COVID pandemic. We are very hopeful that we have turned a corner with vaccinations and a bit more knowledge of how diseases spread. And so we are very pleased to announce that the Institute on Theology and Disability will meet hybrid from June 6th through 9th in 2022 at Methodist Theological School of Ohio in Delaware, Ohio, which is in the same ballpark as. So Keith, I believe, is sharing our fun little flyer here. So you can write down those dates. We'll have more announcements about it up on our social media pages. In particular, there's a Facebook page, which is fairly active. And if you studied the faces of people who are here today, you will probably recognize several of those names as active on the Facebook group as well. So two opportunities for you to continue these conversations, to find yourselves in the same room or at least in the same Zoom breakout session as some other brilliant artists and authors, people who speak on this in really creative ways and bring out these wonderful conversations, not just through their writing, but really through a whole immersive emotional trip. So those are the two opportunities that I have to name today. Beyond that, we do have a few more minutes. So if anyone has particular questions for Brian or for Keith, then perhaps the best way to do it would be if you click on the very bottom row of your sort of black bar, there's a button called Participants. And if you click that, I believe then you have the option, it pops up with a little pop-up screen. There's an option to click yes and no. If you do have a question, if you click yes, I believe I will be able to see it. And then I can maybe call on to unmute and to ask your question. And if you need to type your question rather than verbalize it, then you can just put it directly in the chat. I see a question here from Dr. Sarah Barton. I'll ask you to unmute.
Thanks, Dr. Andrus, and thanks to you both, Keith and Brian. I have a question that could probably take an hour, but from either your book or the other person's book, what's the conversation that you most hope continues to expand and critique and enliven the field of disability theology coming out of your work? And I apologize if this was a question before, I just hopped on after teaching. So ignore if you've already answered it.
I'll maybe go quickly and then I'll turn it back over to Brian. But as someone who is involved in the Institute on Theology and Disability, one of the things that I've really appreciated is the community aspect of it. That it's not just academics drawing together. It's people with lived experience, people from social services, people from all these different places, and so. One of the things that I'd love to see going forward is just continued appreciation for curiosity, I guess, that whenever someone shows up in these spaces, it's a matter of, okay, like let's share our stories. Let's realize that all of our stories are in flux and all of our stories are, ask us again in a year and we might have a slightly different story that we would tell, right? But how do we have grace with one another? While at the same time, and I don't want to just gloss over this, while at the same time, not simply privileging people who have normally had privilege and giving people who normally can speak on these things the power to do so, right? So there's, again, both the accountability of some of those structures and systemic barriers with the receptivity and the grace and the, hearing of each other's stories.
Yeah, I won't add anything to that other than to kind of reiterate that, well, as I've put it in the disability reader, I think we modern Western Christians think of the human in best case scenario terms. And that means we're not really thinking about the human at all. And so this discussion should go into all the nooks and crannies of why the best case scenario is really a type of illusion. I mean, it does happen, but the idea that you're really capable and normal that's the black hole around which many of these problems, both practically and theoretically, are circling. And I think Keith and I are both trying to say, what does the church and the world look like that actually it no longer narrates itself as normal? Because when we are in fact past that I draw on the 1 Corinthians 12 language of we have become members of one another. So we're finding it harder to say, oh, this is me and my group, and our interests are somehow in conflict with those other people and their needs. So when somebody comes into church who is part of that group, we think, oh no, we wanted somebody who would give a lot of money and be kind of high prestige, but it's not that person, it's somebody else who's low prestige and who isn't going to contribute, who's actually going to cost us. And I think that's the sin of normalcy that of course infects the church badly, and is sort of the default setting in the world. And if we can, I would like to see theology operate differently beyond its presumption of normalcy.
Great. All right. I believe Lorraine Williams has a question, and then we'll probably formally wrap up with the responses to hers. Take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having this platform. This is awesome. My question is directed to Dr. Brock. With the experience you went through with Adam over the years at your church, did the congregants, it's a two-part question, did the congregants ever accept or begin to understand Adam's ways in being church? And the second question is, were you given a chance or an opportunity to address the congregants and, for lack of a better word, educate them about Adam, and so that it would be more of an inclusive and a more accepting way for Adam? Like, was there any kind of connectivity, or was it just you go, you sit, you receive from the pastor, and that's it, that's all?
There's a lot I could say to that, but I would say that Adam's role was not to educate a community that was genuinely desirous of learning what it means to be a kind of welcoming and inclusive community. It fancied describing itself in those terms, but was very effectively inoculated from that having any practical reality. So to me, here's another answer to Keith's question is, how's the hope work? Like, he wasn't demoralized by that. I was badly demoralized by that, but it was already a kind of constant challenge to me. Who is the church here? And what does the fact that he's not losing his enthusiasm to be here tell me about who I should understand the church to be? And that doesn't mean everybody there didn't get it at all. That would be overstating the case, but the majority certainly didn't. And so what he did for years was essentially say, this isn't a closed system. where everybody is understanding things the same way, and in which people with disabilities have no place. It was a high performance church, to put it, in simple terms. Adam was simply not high performance, and he didn't want to be high performance, and he wasn't demoralized by other people wanting to be high performance around him, and he unsettled them because he, if you want to be high performance, the sound has to sound right, and if somebody makes a sound at the wrong time, then it kind of starts to look a little bit dumb to want to be high performance to the exclusion of somebody making a funny sound at the wrong time. But clearly, if that's what if your faith is actually about that, it will be painful to you. So I mean, it really is genuinely the case, and I probably have some pessimistic sides of the type that Keith very courageously admitted to, but that Adam wasn't demoralized by being at church, and Sunday in and Sunday out, he found ways to engage with it. That showed me what it means to be a Christian in the church, the actual church, not the ideal church.
Okay. Well, we are just past time, so I would love to thank everyone for their participation today, and especially thank Brian and Keith for just the incredible depth of knowledge and wisdom that they have shared with us. I will just say, because everyone else is on mute, on behalf of everyone, thank you. We appreciated it, and it was well worth our time. I'll stay on just for 1 minute longer. There is in the chat several bits of information, links that are useful, and at the very top, or actually kind of near the bottom now as well, in two places, I've put the promo code. I have put the promo code for the Baylor University Press discount, and it's highly advisable that you go and check out all of their offerings. Baylor Press has done not just great work in general in theology, which they have, but a dedicated series in disability theology, of which I've read almost every title. There's a couple new ones that I still need to get, but I can tell you they are all worth your time. And so that's one of the several links you should go and check out right now. Other than that, thank you all so much for coming and for being attentive. And again, especially to David, Brian, and Keith, thank you again. Hopefully we'll see you all at the Institute, or our paths will cross at some point elsewhere.
Great job. This is wonderful.
I think so. And Jack,